All right, I want to welcome everyone to class. As we know, we're going to be covering Chapter 7. And Chapter 7 focuses on deviance and issues of crime. So this is the chapter where we're going to focus on, what deviance is, how deviance is relative, or what we mean when we say deviance is relative. We're going to focus on some of the perspectives in terms of analyzing or examine why people deviate. And we're going to talk about some of the goals of punishment. All right, so as always, I want you guys to be focusing when you're reading the chapter. I want you guys to be focusing on the objectives. And as you can see, there's a lot of objectives because this is a long chapter. The PowerPoint here covers most of these objectives. And so the ones that we do not cover in the PowerPoint, obviously it is your responsibility because you're going to see these same objectives on the exam or in the assignments that you're going to be required to do. All right, so let's go into the first objective, and that is to define what deviance is. As you see here, deviance is defined as any sort of behavior or belief or condition that violates a social norm. It goes against a norm, whether it's an informal norm or formal norm within our society. And remember, we talked about what norms are within chapter 3. So when you violate these norms, you are being deviant. Now, there are many examples of deviance: being mentally ill, being an alcoholic, could be defined as deviant, being late for class, being overweight, and we're going to talk about ideas of beauty in a minute, being a drug addict, even talking in church. All of these would be deviant because in church, when you go to church, the norm is for you to sit quietly and listen to the pastor. And so when you're talking, when you're not paying attention, that is a violation of the norm. Now, that is an informal norm. So again, when we talk about violating norms, we're talking about formal as well as informal norms. Now, one of the things I want you to think about is, are there certain actions or belief or behavior that is universally seen as wrong? And what I mean by that is, are there certain actions or activity or belief that is wrong in every society, in every culture? And I want you to think about that. Now, if you answered no, then you would be correct. And in sociology, nothing is universally seen as deviant because deviance in sociology is seen as something that is relative. And again, make sure you understand what this concept means. A lot of students have issues with this, so please make sure you understand what this means when we say that deviance is relative. So let me take some time here to explain it. Now, when we say deviance is relative, what we mean here is that what is defined as deviant changes over time. So what is considered deviant today may not be considered deviant tomorrow. And so what we define as right or wrong changes from time to time. And I'm going to give you an example of what I'm talking about. The other aspect of deviance being relative is that what is defined as deviant is actually learned from the group or the culture in which you come from. And remember, as we spoke about in chapter 3, different cultures have different belief systems. They have different ideas, have different values and norms. And so different cultures have different ideas of what is right or wrong. And so what is wrong in one society may not be considered wrong in another society. And so deviance is learned from the group or the culture in which you come from. So this is what we mean when we say deviance is relative. It changes over time, and it's learned. What is defined as deviant is actually learned from the group or the culture you come from. All right, now let's talk about a couple of examples here of how deviance changes over time. And again, this goes back into deviance being. So remember we said here that what is considered wrong today may not be considered wrong tomorrow and vice versa. Now, an example of this, of how deviance changes or what is considered deviant changes, is that in 1919, with the passage of the 18th Amendment, it was actually illegal for Americans of any age to drink alcohol. And this was, as you guys should know, during Prohibition, when drinking alcohol was seen as illegal. It was seen as wrong, and you could have gotten actually arrested for drinking alcohol regardless of your age. Now, obviously today things have changed, and so this is why we have alcohol commercials on television. So there's a lot of drinking, and so drinking now is seen as socially acceptable. Um, Particularly if you're of a certain age, right? If you're underage, it's still seen as deviant, but if you're over age, it is seen as acceptable. And so this is how what is considered deviant changes from one time to the next. The other aspect of deviance being relative is what is defined as deviant is actually learned from the group or the culture in which you come from. And again, we talked about in chapter 3 the importance of culture. So let me give an example of the relative nature of deviance. Now, if you look on the ideas of beauty around the world, you see here that different cultures have different ideas of beauty, right? So what is considered beautiful in one culture may not be considered beautiful in another culture. And we see this in our definition of beauty in this country for the most part. And this is for mainly for the dominant culture. For the most part, being beautiful in this country is defined as being thin. And so this is why we have all of these magazines with images like what you see in front of you as a definition or an idea of what beauty is. And so in our society, being beautiful is defined as being thin. And sometimes it's very thin. In other societies, however, such as Nigerian society, being big is actually seen as beautiful. So if a thin woman were to go to Nigeria, they would actually be defined as deviant, right? Because in Nigeria, being big is actually seen as being beautiful, being acceptable. As a matter of fact, in Nigerian society, if you're too thin, you're seen as poor because it is the idea that you cannot afford to buy your own food. And so women actually go into what is defined as fattening rooms in order to gain weight, to gain weight for marriage. And if you have never heard about what fattening rooms are, you can simply Google it, and you can learn about what fattening rooms are. But this is a quite interesting cultural example of the ideas of beauty and how different cultures have different ideas and definitions of beauty. And so again, this is what we mean when we say deviance is relative. It changes from time to time, and it is learned from the group or the culture in which you come from. All right, now one of the questions that we're going to focus on is why do people become deviant? And we're going to talk about several theories that you need to know. The first one is the structural strain theory. Then we'll get into the conflict theory. And then we'll end by talking about the symbolic interactionist theory in terms of why people deviate. Now, the structural strain theory is part of the structural functionalist. So this is, part of the, the ideas of the structural functionalist theory. Now, from the structural strain theory, which again, as I said, is part of the structural functionalist, the structural strain theory is an idea put forth by Robert Merton, right? And Robert Merton argues here that people in this country are taught to strive for certain goals. And one of the most important goals that most Americans are taught to strive for is to achieve their American dream. And we know that the American dream is an idea where you go to school, you work hard, you get a decent job where you can support yourself and support your family. And then when you have your own family, you send your kids to good school so that they can get their education and they themselves can achieve their American dream. So this is part of the American dream. This is one of the reasons why a lot of immigrants come here to achieve their own American dream. So achieving this American dream and striving for their American dream is a very important part of our culture. Now, what Merton argues or asks actually is, or says actually, is for those who believe in the goal of their American dream of working hard, going to school, getting an education, or starting a job, or starting a company or business or whatever. For those who believe in the goal of the American dream, and for those who have the means or have the ability to achieve their American dream, Merton defines these kind of people as conformist, right? So you guys since you guys are in college, you were, part of the goal here is to finish college so you can get your a decent job and achieve your own American dream, right? Um, Bill Gates, as you can see in the picture on the right, also would be somebody who would be defined as a conformist. He started his company. He was going to university. He started his company, Microsoft, and now he's, if I'm not mistaken, the second richest person on this planet. And so these people would be defined, according to Merton, as conformists. And again, these terms are obviously in your textbook, so please make sure you understand what these terms mean. Now, one of the most interesting questions Merton asks is, what happens to people who, on the one hand, they believe in their American dream, they want to achieve their American dream, but they don't have the opportunity or they don't have the ability to achieve the American dream, right? So let's say, for example, you have an individual who wants to go to college because they want to get a decent job, because we know that in our country, for the most part, you have to have a college education in order to get a decent paying job. Not all the time, but for the most part. And so the reality is that not everybody's able to go to college for whatever reason, whether they have kids and they have to work, or they don't have the resources, they don't have the money, they don't have the time. So Martin argues here, what happens to these people where on the one hand they want to achieve the American dream, but on the other hand they don't have the ability or the means or the opportunity to achieve their dream. And he argues here that a strain or tension develops in these people's life. This is why the theory is called the structural strain theory. And in order to deal with the strain or tension, people adapt in different ways. They either become an innovator, a retreatist, a rebel, or what he defines as a ritualist. And again, the textbook talks about each of these different ways of adaptation. And again, please make sure you understand each of these different ways, because you're going to see this on the exam. Now let's just talk about one of them, and that is the first one, an innovator. Now an innovator would be a person like Tony Montana from the movie Scarface. Hopefully you guys have watched the movie. It is a very famous movie. Old movie, but it's a very famous movie where you have this immigrant from Cuba coming here, and he was very ambitious. Mr. Tony Montana was very ambitious, and he wanted to achieve his own American dream. He was a very, as I said, very ambitious guy. Unfortunately, he did not, at least in his mind, he did not have the ability to go to college. For whatever reason. And that's what, and he, there were conversations in the movie where he said that. And so what happened here is that, a strain or tension developed in his life. So on the one hand, he wanted to achieve the American dream, but on the other hand, he did not have the ability to go to college and get a legitimate job that will enable him to achieve his American dream. So what he did instead, he became an innovator, right? And an innovator is a person who wants to achieve the American dream, but they don't have the legitimate or the legal means to do so. So they do things illegally. And one of the things that Tony Montana did was that he became a very successful drug dealer. And this is how he achieved his American dream, at least in his mind. Now, in the end of the movie, he dies, but for that moment in time, when he was on top, he did achieve in his mind his American dream, albeit illegally, by selling drugs. All right, now we're going to now get into the conflict perspective. And one of the things I want you to think about, I'm going to use the example of certain types of job to illustrate what the conflict perspective argues. And the question I want you to think about is, are there any similarities between the job of modeling and the job of prostitution? And yes, prostitution is a job. And I want you to think about it. What are the similarities between these two jobs? The job of a model and the job of a prostitute. And the next question I want you to think about is, are both of these professions involved in the same business of selling sex, or involved in the business of selling sex? And if you really think about it, the answer would be yes. Both of these jobs, these women, because most models and most prostitutes are women, are selling their bodies. They're selling sex. Now, one could argue that models sell sex indirectly, you know, and prostitutes sell sex directly. But the reality is, if you step back and you look at it critically, both of these jobs are basically in the same business of selling sex, whether it's directly or indirectly. Now, if you disagree with that, I'm going to show you a picture here, and I want you to think about what are these women selling. Now, for those who don't know, the ladies on the top left are models, right? And I know it's sometimes very confusing because sometimes you can't distinguish between the difference between a model and a prostitute because they don't really wear a lot of clothes. But that's the point. The point is both of these women are selling sex. Both of these women are selling sex. And so this is why the bodies of models are so important. The bodies of women are so important. And so both of these women are selling sex. And so essentially, if both of these women are selling sex, which is the product, right? Then the question becomes, from a conflict perspective, why would one profession be seen as uplifting, but the other profession is seen as degrading? If both of these women, models and prostitutes, are selling the same or in the same business of selling sex, whether it's directly or indirectly, why is one profession from a conflict perspective seen as degrading, yet the other profession from a conflict perspective is seen as uplifting? Why is that? Now, the answer is from a conflict perspective, because remember we said here that conflict perspective focuses on issues of social and economic inequalities. And so if you were to ask a conflict theorist that question, why is models and prostitutes viewed so differently, even though they're in the same business of selling sex, a conflict theorist would say that deviance is caused by the inequalities that exist in society, right, between the rich and the poor. Now, behaviors that are associated with the poor tend to be criminalized. So most women who go into prostitution, they go into prostitution because of issues of poverty. Most women don't get up and say, you know what, I want to sell my body for money. That doesn't really happen. So most prostitutes, most women who turn to prostitution do so because of economic inequality. And so what the conflict perspective argues here is that behaviors and activities that tend to be associated with the poor tend to be criminalized, while those that are associated with the middle class and the upper class tend to be celebrated. So on the one hand, you have a situation where those who are from the lower class, when they engage in certain activities, they tend to be criminalized. They tend to be looked down on. But those from the middle and upper class, if they're engaged essentially in the same occupation, they are seen as role models. And so what the conflict perspective says in addition to that is those who are rich and powerful have the power to define what is right and what is wrong. And so models, if you think about it, models mainly work for powerful organizations and businesses and media agencies and media companies. And these companies make money from the bodies of these women. Prostitutes, on the other hand, are powerless. They tend to be powerless. They work for, less powerful entities and less powerful individuals. And so these models who are making money for these organizations and these major companies, these companies have the power in our society to define what is right and to define what is wrong. And so because these businesses are making money off the bodies of these women, they then say, well, this job is okay because essentially we're making money off of their bodies, but women that engage in prostitution, even though it's essentially in the same business of selling sex, that's wrong. And so that's what the conflict perspective argues, that there's a relationship between deviance and power. And again, please again make sure you understand when you read the section, you understand this relationship between power and deviance. Now, typically, when I tell my students that in my class, um, a lot of students completely disagree with me, which is fine, because this is sociology. We're not supposed to always be in agreement. Now, if you disagree, another example of the conflict perspective is what is defined as the affluenza defense. If you have never heard about this defense, I want you guys to Google this term, and also Google, and when you Google it, you should see a story about Mr. Ethan Couch. Now, for those who don't know Mr. Couch here, he was a young man, I think he was 16 at the time, from Texas, came from a very wealthy family. He took his father's truck, took some friends along with him. They got beer illegally. And while he was coming back home or wherever he was going, he was driving the truck, he killed around 4 people. And his defense, his lawyer, and again, remember, he came from a very powerful, very wealthy family. His lawyer came up with the defense of affluenza. And the affluenza defense is the idea that this boy, this young man, because he grew up in such a wealthy family, he did not know right from wrong. He was not trained to know the difference between right or wrong because he was so wealthy. He was so rich. And essentially, the defense worked because Mr. Couch, even though he killed 3 people, he got basically probation. And part of the probation is that his parents agreed to pay for him to have rehab at a $500,000 property or place, rehab facility, I think somewhere in California, if I'm not mistaken. But again, you can do your own research and see. Now, again, I bring up this example as an example of a conflict perspective. And again, it is the notion that, activities and individuals who are rich and powerful are treated very differently than individuals who don't have any power. And so this is what we go back to the difference between prostitutes versus models. Models, because they work for powerful corporations and individuals, they're viewed and treated very differently than other women, even though essentially they're in. And so from a conflict perspective, our entire society is biased in favor of those who are rich and powerful. And when I say our entire society, I mean every aspect of our society. Our criminal justice system is biased in favor of those who are rich and powerful. And I gave you the example of Mr. Ethan Couch. Our mass media is biased in favor of those who are rich and powerful. Politics, for example, if you want to get into politics, one of the things you must have is money, whether it's you yourself are independently wealthy or you have to know people who will give you money to support your campaign. And so this is from a conflict perspective here, then our entire society is biased in favor of those who are rich and powerful. All right, now the final theory that we're going to talk about here is a symbolic interactionist perspective. And the symbolic interactionist perspective basically argues here that deviance is something that is learned by interacting with people who are considered deviant. And remember, we said here that from a symbolic interactionism, the symbolic interactionism focuses on our interactions, the people we interact with, and how these people influence our behavior. And so from a symbolic interactionist perspective, it is the idea that deviance is something that is learned by the people that we hang around with, the people we interact with. And in my class, I normally show you this video of this young boy who is smoking. And one of the reasons why he's smoking is because he was interacting with his uncle who smokes, and the uncle taught him how to smoke. And so this is one of the reasons, I think, if I'm not mistaken, one of your assignments is to talk about, why do people use drugs? And from a symbolic interactionist perspective, they would argue that one of the reasons why people use drugs is because of who they interact with. If you interact with people who are drug users, you yourself are going to learn that behavior and more than likely are going to start to use drugs because of your associations. And so this is part of the differential association theory, which is, again, part of the symbolic interactionist perspective. So again, it is a notion that deviance is something that is learned by the people we interact with, the people we associate ourselves with. So you have to be careful who you associate yourself with, is the point. All right, now in the last section of this of our presentation here, we're going to talk about crime and deviance. And again, one of the questions I want you to think about is, are all examples of deviance a crime? I want you to think about that. Now, you should know by now that not all examples of deviance are criminal, right? Um, for example, one of the things that we talk about, in our society now is kneeling to the national anthem. And Mr. Kaepernick, Colin Kaepernick, have brought that issue in the mass media. And kneeling is, according to some people, very deviant, because normally if we are saying the Pledge of Allegiance or the national anthem, you're supposed to stand up, right? And so by kneeling, for some people, it is viewed as deviant. But it is not a crime. Mr. Kaepernick is not going to be arrested for kneeling. So even though he's being deviant, is not a criminal offense. So not all examples of deviance are criminal. Now, let's talk about what crime is. And we know that, and there are different types of crime, but first of all, crime is defined as a violation of a norm that has been made into a law for which you can be arrested. So crime would be an example of a formal norm. So all crimes would be an example of formal norms. And remember, we again spoke about the difference between formal norm versus informal norm. So all crimes would be an example of formal norms. Now, there are two general types of crime: felonies. These are serious crimes such as rape and homicide, where punishment ranges from 1 or more years in prison. A misdemeanor is a minor crime that is punishable by less than 1 year in jail. Right? So these are two types of crime: felonies and misdemeanors. Now, the last thing that we're going to talk about here, and the last couple of slides, are a couple of ways of controlling crime. Now, there are 3 ways of controlling crime that we focus on here, or the textbook focuses on. Deterrence is the first way, retribution, and rehabilitation. So let's talk about each of these terms and concepts. Okay, so deterrence is when we try to stop people from committing crime in the first place by instilling fear of punishment or fear of some consequence. So, for example, the death penalty would be an example of deterrence, where it is the idea that if we make the punishment harsh enough, people will not commit crime in the first place. So if somebody knows, for example, that if you commit a crime, you're going to get the death penalty, the idea here is that that person is less likely to commit that crime. So we try to deter somebody from engaging in crime in the first place. So this is what deterrence means. The second goal of punishment is retribution. And retribution essentially is when we try to get even with somebody for violating the law. Now, this country is very good at retribution. And one of the ways in which we punish people is by sending people to jail. And so this is why we have one of the highest incarceration rate in the world. We arrest and incarcerate more people than any other country on this planet currently. And one of the questions that we have to face is, should juvenile be charged as an adult? Juveniles who commit heinous crimes, should they be charged as an adult? And believe it or not, there are some states, Florida is one of them, that where juveniles can be charged as an adult. And when you charge a juvenile, and juvenile, these are individuals who are below the age of 18 who engage in criminal activity. And so when you charge a juvenile as an adult, then you can punish them as an adult, right? And so that's why charging juveniles as adults is a very serious thing. And this is why most countries don't do it, right? Because the idea here is that if you send a juvenile to jail, to prison, they may never come out. And if they come out, they're probably going to be worse off, right? And so retribution is one of the main ways in this country in terms of how we punish people for violating a law or violating a norm. The the final thing that we're gonna talk about here is rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is where we try to reform or change an individual so that they may re-enter society. So we try to change somebody who violates a law, so that when they leave prisons or jail, they can re-enter society and become productive members of society. Unfortunately, we don't really do a good job at rehabilitation. This is why a lot of people who come out of jail, they go back to jail within 3 to 5 years. And so we as a society, we have to do a better job at rehabilitation, because the reality is that most people who go to jail will come out of jail. And for those who say that, we need to punish these people and not rehabilitate them, the reality is that we are the ones who are paying to have these people behind bars. And so this is why one of the questions I normally ask my class is, should individuals who are serving time in jail, should they have an opportunity to receive high school and college degrees while serving time in prison? And the reason why I ask that question is because if you look at the statistics, most individuals who are serving time in jail in prisons are high school dropouts. They didn't even finish high school. And so this is why a lot of people who drop out of high school, they end up in jail, because we know that without any high school education, without any formal education, it's going to be very difficult for you to find decent, high-paying jobs. And so a lot of people then turn to crime as a result of that. And so this is why, providing rehabilitation in prison is very important. Now, I'm sure there's some of you guys who say, well, why should I pay for individuals who are serving time in jail and give these people college education? The answer to that would be, statistics and research have shown that if you provide people, individuals who are serving time in jail, educational opportunities, an opportunity to earn a high school degree, an opportunity to earn a college degree in prison, when they are released, they are much less likely to return to prison. And so if they don't return to prison, then that means that we don't have to pay to have them behind bars. And for those who don't know, in some states in this country, New York, for example, in some places in New York, it costs over $60,000 per year to have one person behind bars. And if you actually look it up, how much it costs to have a person behind bars in the state of Florida, it's over $20,000. And so for those who have problems providing education, providing these individuals education, then the question you got to ask yourself is, which one would you rather pay? Would you rather pay to have $20,000 to have these individuals behind bars for an entire year, or give them education, give them an opportunity to succeed, give them an opportunity to change their lives so that they can become productive members of society? And so that is the question that a lot of us have to be faced with, and a lot of states have to be faced with, because to have all of these men, and it's mostly men behind bars, it costs a lot of money. And so this is why we have to change our focus in terms of how we deal with people who are deviant and violate formal norms in our society. Anyway, that is it for our chapter 7. I want to thank you for listening.